name is Tibayan, pastor of Bethany Baptist Church in Bellflower, California. And in this video, I'd like to talk to you about preaching using study tools, or how do you use study tools in your preparation for preaching sermons to God's people. We all want to improve our sermons, and God has given us many resources outside of ourselves that we have access to help our preaching become more informed and more effective for God's glory and the edification of God's people. The problem is that we have so many tools and so little time. There are all kinds of tools on the internet. There's now Bible software, as well as books upon books upon books of resources for many preachers to use that it can become so overwhelming, and we have to preach a sermon week after week after week. So, how do we use our tools most effectively to preach and teach the Bible every week? Here are some things that have helped me in my last 20 years of preaching. First of all, it's important to define what we're doing in preaching. What is expository preaching? Expository preaching is when the words and goal of the sermon text in its canonical context, in context of the whole Bible, controls the words and goal of the sermon preached to God's people. Okay, let me shorten that. The words and goal of the biblical text controls the words and goal of my sermon. That's what expository preaching is. And so that's what you got to keep in mind. The goal is for me to take God's word and preach it to my hearers. That's the goal. And if you keep that goal in mind, you got to think, how do these tools help me get God's word to God's people in a way that's clear and helpful? Because there are 1,000 things and 1,000 rabbit trails you could chase and think about and study in the process of sermon preparation. But if it doesn't get to your goal of preaching that text to your people, then you might need to cut that from your preparation time. All right, so how do you use study tools, or what study tools can you use? I would say, first of all, your first tool is the Bible itself. It is the thing you're preaching. So read the text again and again and again, write down your observation, and one of the tools is translations. Use many translations of the Bible. Of course, the original languages are the best tools, so look at Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic if you can read and use those. But if you can't, or even if you can, use many different translations of the Bible. Look at the text in 5 or 10 different translations and mark where there are differences in translation and figure out why there are differences there. One other tool that you can use is your neighbors, your members of your church, and even non-Christian neighbors. Read the passage to them and ask them what they think. Their observations become a tool in how people are thinking and looking at your passage. Of course, when you're studying the Bible, you can look at word studies. Now, you have to be careful there. Study the word, but words are always used in context. So it's good to look at the word and all the uses of the word in different passages and in classical history and in Jewish history. So you could use lexicons to go deep into these things, and dictionaries that go deep into the history of a word. But make sure that you look at the word and then apply it to its actual context when you're doing word studies. Another tool that I use is to find the structure of a passage is I use Bible arcing or diagramming or block diagramming or bracketing, where you're looking at the flow of the argument. And so that tool is really looking at the therefores and the ands and the buts and the so that's and the howevers. And you're looking at all of those conjunctions to really see the logical flow of a passage. So if I'm reading, Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, as it is written," there's the word as it is written, "the righteous will live by faith. For God's righteous wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in their unrighteousness." You have all of these words in Romans 1:16 through 18, where it says, for, as it is written, for God's wrath is revealed. And so there's a logical flow there. And so find tools to help you mark the logical flow of the passage. In stories and narrative, that's not as helpful, though it can be helpful sometimes. But in stories and narratives, the arc of the story, the character development, the tension, the conflict in the story, the climax and the resolution to the conflict, those are things you want to analyze as you study a passage. So if you're looking at literary context, you can look at the story arc in that regard if it's discourse. If it's poetry, then you want to look at parallelism and imagery and contrasts and comparisons. So look at the structure, and you could use different tools for literature. So Leland Ryken has at least 3 or 4 books to look at literary forms and to know how the literature works just generally as a pattern to help you study your passage. And then when you're also looking at the literature, you can look at concordances for the uses of the words. You could look at Greek and Hebrew grammars to know the syntax of a passage. And you can look at dictionaries to know the language. You also want to use historical tools to know the historical context. So there are books on the history of the Jewish world and the Israelite world and the first century world under the Roman Empire. And you'll see all of these things in commentaries as well. An atlas can be helpful to know the geographical lay of the situation for your sermon text. And then one of the most helpful tools I would recommend is the commentary on the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament, edited by D.A. Carson and Greg Beale. It takes the passages of the New Testament that are quoting or alluding to passages in the Old Testament and shows how those two things work together to understand how it fits in biblical context. You also want to look at cultural and religious context, and so Bible books on the customs and manners of the day would be helpful. And you'll find all of those things, a lot of those different things, in commentaries. So maybe the most regular tool that we think of when we prepare sermons is commentaries. They have word studies, they got geographical context, historical context, cultural context, literary context, and genre. And so I just want to say 3 things here about commentaries and then point to one other tool. The first thing is that there are different kinds of commentaries. There are exegetical commentaries that focus really on the text and its structure and its emphasis. There are commentaries that are stronger in historical context or cultural context. There are some commentaries that are really strong on theology. And there are other commentaries that are really strong on not practical context, but practical application of the text. And so you'll find more exegetical kinds of commentaries, some more expositional commentaries, and maybe some more practical commentaries. And those are all helpful in different ways. So just know the different commentaries and what their strengths are as you're studying. Second thing I want to say about commentaries is when to use them. Use those commentaries after you have come up with your own main goal and outline of the sermon. That's what I would recommend. Do your own main goal and outline of the sermon yourself in your own study, and then after that, use commentaries to check your work. And then lastly, I would say, while you're doing that, when you're studying the text, write down all of your questions about the text. All your questions about the text. And then from that, write down your own answers to those questions. This is what Mark Dever has taught me. Write down your own answers to those questions. And after you do that, then read commentaries, because now I'm reading my answers to my questions, and I'm comparing my answers to the answers of the commentators. And so when you do that, you're now not just leaning on the commentaries and just taking their answers for yourself. You're actually having a conversation with the commentaries because you're comparing and contrasting your answers with theirs. And they might convince you of certain things, or you might reason against them. But the point is now you're dialoguing with commentaries rather than just repeating them in your sermon. One other thing I'd say as a preacher to preachers is use other people's sermons. Again, don't do this until you've studied the text yourself and come up with your own main goal and your outline for your text. But once you do that, listen to other people's sermons and how they understand the text and how they communicate the text and apply the text to their people. That has been a tremendous tool in my study and preparation. I want to call you in this video to preach from your own study first. So form your own main goal and points, and then go to the commentaries. If not, these tools can take over your sermon. But if you study the text for yourself and the context for yourself and come up with your own main goal and your own outline and your own applications first, and then you go to these tools will enhance and strengthen and guide and correct your sermon so that you're ready to preach this sermon to your people. May God bless the preaching of the word through your ministry.